Hey folks, Mark Scroggins with Scroggins Law Group back for another episode of the Reclamation Transformation. And once again, we have Cindy Hyde with Living Strong Counseling. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. What's new that's been going on? It's been a little bit.
You know what? It has been a little bit, but when you're working all the time, that's what happens. So time
That's
flies, right?
that's exactly right. I look back and it's like, gosh, it's been a couple months, but
It
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 seems like
has.
it's hard to believe that
I
it's
know.
actually been that long.
Yeah. And
So
now we're in winter clothes, right? And so
exactly,
before we were in summer clothes. So yeah,
exactly.
I'm
So
loving the cool snap.
a little
Yeah.
different look. I can pull out the
Yeah,
vests and
that's
stuff
right.
now. So,
Yeah,
well, we are back to talk a little bit more about, you and I were talking about cluster B
we were.
prior to starting this. So, as
Yeah.
a refresher for
Mm-hmm.
those out there, can
Mm-hmm.
you, refresh
Yeah.
our recollection of what exactly cluster B entails?
Yes. So, one of the things that most people don't realize, everybody comes in like you and I were talking about, like
Right,
both into my office and yours,
right,
saying, I'm with a narcissist, I'm with a textbook narcissist,
right.
right?
Yep,
Well, really, that's not true. There isn't just a narcissist. That's where the misnomer really is that people think I'm with a narcissist. Well, no, actually, narcissism falls under cluster B personality disorder.
right,
And what that means is cluster means more than one. And so narcissism always overlaps with at least one other personality disorder. And those are antisocial, which is sociopath,
right.
psychopath, and borderline personality disorder. So it's never just narcissism. It's usually narcissism and either two or three other, or four, excuse me, four other personality disorders. And so most of the time, what my mission is when I'm working with a client is to determine exactly which ones they dealt with because they're all different.
Right.
And what most people don't know is that with narcissism, really narcissism is mostly about no empathy, attention seeking, and grandiosity.
Right.
And so what psychopath is really about is the manipulation, the deceit, the no empathy. It shares that with narcissism,
Hmm.
and also like the egocentricity, all about me. But most people, because of the bloggers and influencers and all of that these days, think that all of that is narcissism when in fact it's really not. Most of the time, they're actually dealing with a psychopath and not just a narcissist. Yeah.
Before we get into
Mm-hmm.
borderline in more detail,
Mm-hmm.
one other thing that I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about, because I had this in a case just recently and I was trying to explain to the person there's a huge difference here and they weren't getting it.
Right.
But can you explain the difference
Mm-hmm.
between someone actually having a diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
of narcissism or
Mm-hmm.
psychopathy or sociopath
Mm-hmm.
or something along those lines,
Right.
as compared to having tendencies? Like,
Right.
someone does
Mm-hmm.
does testing
Right.
and they say so and so has these tendencies.
Right.
So
Right.
can you explain the
Yes.
difference between those,
I can
please?
actually. So the DSM, which is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual,
Right.
which is what all therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists use to diagnose. So in the case of narcissism, there's only 9 criteria that can apply,
Okay.
and 5 have to be met. So when I'm working with a client to determine if their spouse had narcissism, what I look at is if 5 of the criteria are met, right, in what they experience. If there was only 2, well, then they have some traits, but they are not diagnosable in that. The same thing with psychopath. There's like 31 criteria and 10 have to apply for it to be diagnosable.
Okay.
And so if they only have 5, then they have some traits, but they're not diagnosed. They
And
couldn't be diagnosed for that.
and pretty
Mm-hmm.
commonplace
Mm-hmm.
for people, everybody, to
Mm-hmm.
be walking around with these different, with traits
Right.
that you could put under some of these
Right.
different diseases
Right.
as, you know, set forth in the DSM.
Correct. Yes. And so you always want to make sure, see a professional. And even as an attorney, like if you really wanted to know, were they truly dealing with a narcissist? If you had a DSM in your office, you could quickly look to see like, oh, yeah, okay, plausibly
Right.
they are. Because you or I, neither one can diagnose someone we don't know, right? And so,
course.
but we could say plausibly,
Right.
this person meets at least 5 of the criteria. And so, then we know that this person really probably was with somebody that was personality disordered.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just interesting because I had a case where, someone was talking about, there were actual psychological evaluations that had been performed. And so it was talking about, so-and-so has traits of this or has this trait or that trait.
Right.
But it's like that is far and away different from actually having a diagnosis.
Right.
Because I can be walking along the streets and I've got certain traits that can fit into different categories, but it doesn't mean that I'm a narcissist or a sociopath or psychopath or, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Right. And the theory is really we all have a little self-absorption, right? I mean, if you say you don't, I'm sorry, you do.
That's right.
Somewhere in your life, right? And so some people would say, well, we all have a little narcissism then.
Absolutely.
And maybe so. But it does, for you and I, we have to know, is this person plausibly diagnosable? The problem is a lot of these personality disordered people are really slippery and they're smart. And so they can go in and take an assessment and they'll come out looking like they're the greatest person on earth when actually they are disordered.
Right.
And so that's where it gets sticky, especially in a court situation. Even if they do a psych eval, it may or may not come out the way that it should.
Well, of course, because so much is self-reporting.
Right.
Exactly. And so self-reporting is based on the belief that people are going to be truthful when seeking, seeking help.
Right.
And so I don't think it properly takes into consideration sometimes when it's court ordered. And so you've got people that they know what you are looking for.
Yes.
And so they are not truthful in the self-reporting, whether it be, taking notes or whether it is, responding to a bubble print, multiple choice type test.
Exactly. And that's why sometimes the psych evals don't come back, when most everyone knows the person probably is personality disordered, but it comes back that they're not.
Right.
And so that can happen because you're exactly right. If they know they're being tested for personality disorders, well, then they're most likely going to try really hard not to look like they have one. So yeah, that can happen.
Well, and I think it's super important too, to hit on what you were talking about all of us having a little bit of narcissism. I'm sure as a business owner, that I have some of that, some of those traits because I have to be able to run a successful business. And so there is such, though, a huge difference from having certain traits to being a full-blown narcissist or psychopath or sociopath. And I think it's important for people to understand that. I mean, just because... And this is a little crass, but I mean, just because someone's an asshole doesn't make them a narcissist.
Exactly. And the thing is, though, is the one way that you can really tell if someone truly is personality disordered is there is no empathy. They don't have compassion. Now, here's where it also gets a little tricky because a lot of people that are personality disordered can look very altruistic, and they can look altruistic and very giving because they do that for their image and they get a lot of praise that way, right? But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, they don't have true empathy. They can wear a mask that says they do, but they can't sustain it. And so it's really to be able to observe somebody over a period of time to see whether there is true empathy and compassion there or not. And so that overlaps in almost all of the disorders is a lack of empathy. And so that's that's really the telltale time. But that's the telltale
Sign.
sign was the word. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. But it's a telltale sign of whether or not they are personality disordered or not.
So we are really going down a rabbit trail here, and I apologize.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
So how do you really test empathy, though?
Right. Well, they're
Because that
actually
seems to be really difficult. I
Yeah.
mean, because if somebody says, "Oh, well, does it bother you to see somebody abusing collie puppies?"
Yeah.
Everybody's going to say yes.
Yeah, there are actual assessments out there that,
Right.
that test for that.
Right.
And so you can actually tell if someone has a low empathy assessment. Yeah.
And I understand there are those. I just have, my own skepticism is
Right.
is showing through and thinking that I'm not talking about, Tom who goes in
Right.
because he wants to know about himself and is really concerned. I'm thinking about Harry, who on the other hand
Yeah.
is court ordered
Yeah.
to, and so he's going to present himself
Right.
in a certain
Yes.
way
Oh, yes. I love
that I know
everyone.
is
Yeah.
total bullshit,
Right.
but that because of that, it
Right.
doesn't come back the way
Right.
you would expect that it would.
Exactly. And that's where too then you really have to have people that can be a witness to the fact that this person is harmful
Right.
and doesn't show empathy to people and is abusive, right? In various ways. And so that's where, like in your field, you would want probably some witnesses or some affidavits of some sort stating the experiences that people have actually experienced with this person,
Right.
in order to be able to at least say that it's very plausible.
Right.
Right.
Right. Well, now that we have gone down that rabbit trail,
Yes.
and I apologize for that, but that is something that
Yeah.
this is such an interesting area and it has such an impact.
It
And
does.
I think the courts can get so confused and not just with whether or not people are actually diagnosable as, this, that, or the other, but then how do you apply it and
Right.
to what impact?
Right.
So it's super interesting to me.
Yes.
Especially from an academic standpoint, as well as from boots on the ground
Yes.
type of deal. But
Yeah.
so now let's get over into talking about borderline personality disorder.
Yes, which is one of the cluster Bs.
Right.
So again, we're going to have some overlap because typically cluster is more than one.
Right.
Right. And so, at the end of the day, we're not just talking about narcissism. We're not just talking about borderline. We're talking about personality disorders that overlap.
Right.
Right. And so borderline is one of those, and it has some very distinct features. The first and foremost feature that it has is this severe fear of abandonment. And so that can show up relationally, and so somebody can marry someone and unbeknownst to them not know that they have borderline personality disorder, but they know that that person is always worried that they're going to leave them or that they don't love them. And so they're constantly trying to prove to this person that they do. And so that's the biggest sign. Secondly is the irritability. And so a lot of times what a borderline person will do is they'll basically write a story in their brain about what's really happening. And so once they write that story, they believe that story. And so like say that we're, you and I and your significant other, I know that you're a married person, but let's just say you're not and you're there with a significant other and you don't really know this person very well. And let's say you and I walk in to the kitchen and leave this person sitting in the living room. That person, as a borderline person, may write the story that we just left her and that we don't care about her. And all of a sudden, the next thing you know, we walk back in and she's mad and she's angry and she's very emotional.
Right.
And that's what it can look like a lot of times with a borderline person. They also, it's not uncommon for them to have addictions or high impulsivity in several areas. Like, let's just say with females, it tends to be spending and alcohol, right? With males, it can be gambling and sex, right? And so, but they have a very high impulsivity ratio usually that is different from just the average person. In addition to that, they're highly reactive. And so like the scenario that I just created with, us leaving the room and causing a reaction with that person, it can be a very big reaction. And it can go a couple of ways. It can show up in anger, or it can show up in a complete meltdown. And they've written this story and they believe this story. And then it's your job then to have to convince them that the story is inaccurate. And this isn't just like a once in a while occurrence. This is usually weekly, daily. So the partner or the spouse of the person with borderline can really feel like they're walking on eggshells. And so a lot of times what happens in a relationship is that person that's with the borderline person stops telling them things. They start hiding things because they're so afraid of the reaction in the story that might get written.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a little scary. It's interesting because from a litigation standpoint, they can be the hardest to actually deal with. So I've got a good friend who I had actually represented in his divorce. That's how we met, and subsequently ended up becoming good friends. But there was a diagnosis on the other side of borderline, and oh my gosh.
Right.
I mean, the just dealing with reality was, versus what the script was in her head. And it was like, no, there's really not some hidden agenda here to do X, Y, and Z. It's that this is what we're trying to accomplish. So, I mean, super difficult.
It can be incredibly difficult, especially once, like you said, the script or the story gets written. It's hard to get them off of that they really believe it. And one of the things that can be a sign of it is high anxiety. A lot of borderline diagnosed people they have very high anxiousness. And so, and that's a way to spot that, is that if they have, and not all, right? Not all, but it is a sign. And so, if you're dating someone that has high anxiety, just pay attention. And, if you're starting to see some high reactivity, you might want to take a second look and see it as a flag, because it very well could be. But typically high anxiety is one of the symptoms of it.
So just once again, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole for a second. I mean, so what kind of treatment is out there for somebody who's got borderline personality disorder?
And what I was going to say too is also depression can be a part of that as well.
Right.
And one of the criteria, the DSM criteria, is suicidality. And so sometimes, if they're an extreme case, they can have high suicidality. But there is actually, as for all of the personality disorders out there, the four main ones, borderline is the most treatable. Does it go away? No, it doesn't go away. It is still a diagnosis that really is lifetime. But there is a treatment out there called dialectical behavior therapy that was created by a woman named Marsha Linehan. And Marsha was also borderline, and she just started figuring out what was working for her. And so she created things like emotional regulation skills and distress tolerance skills. And then she utilized some mindfulness. And her therapies have so many different skills that can be implemented. How to have a hard conversation, a conflict conversation with someone, where a borderline person might be really reactive trying to have a conversation. It teaches them step by step how to do it where it can keep their emotions down. And so it's quite intensive. And there's a lot of, it's called DBT, so dialectical behavior therapy. And there's a lot of groups out there that you can get involved if you feel like that you might be borderline, or even if you struggle with emotional regulation or distress tolerance. It would be a great group for you to try, even if you're not borderline, to get some skills to help you. But look for DBT groups, look for DBT therapists that can help you learn some skills.
That's interesting to me, because, we hear about, and I'm one of those people that you hear about, tends to wear their emotions on their sleeve.
Right.
you
Right.
know? And so I'm hearing this and I'm like,
Hmm.
uh-oh.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we all need a little emotional regulation,
Right,
right?
right.
But
So
it really it does it has some really helpful skills in it, especially if you have a borderline diagnosis.
let's talk a little bit about the difference between a borderline personality
Hmm.
and a narcissist
Hmm. Yeah.
personality.
And so research indicates now it's not in the DSM, but it is starting to show in research that there's two different types. If truly narcissism is the diagnosis with the 9 criteria,
Right.
the research is starting to show that there is two subtypes, which can be grandiosity and vulnerable. Right. And
Okay.
so the vulnerable, which I'm not quite sure if I subscribe to both subtypes yet. I think they're all one and the same personally, just
Right.
from what I've experienced with my clients. But I will say that the research is starting to indicate that there is such a thing as a vulnerable narcissist. And what that is it's that person that always goes victim, that person that feels slighted all the time,
Right.
you know, that they're very highly sensitive to criticism or feedback, right? And so that too is also where it overlaps with somebody that's borderline because they're very sensitive to criticism or feedback. They can be very emotional and feel very victimized over the littlest thing. And so that is where it would overlap.
Right.
But two, if it's part of cluster B, typically narcissism is where it will overlap with a borderline person. And so as they're writing that script, it's all about me. And so they're not really thinking about how their reaction or their emotions are going to affect that other person. And that's the same with narcissism. So typically with borderline, the overlap would be with narcissism, whether it's grandiose or vulnerable. And excuse me, but
Hmm.
with narcissism, the overlap is typically with psychopath and sociopath. And so it can overlap with borderline and does, but typically it's with those other two.
Typically it's on the other side.
Correct.
Okay. So
Right.
borderline, if you were going to put one characteristic
Hmm.
that generally, sets it apart
Hmm.
from the other, is it really this sense of victimization,
Hmm. It's the reactivity.
the
It's
reactivity?
the high reactivity. Yeah, they will react. Like a lot of times, they'll have a lot of problems in the workplace because they're very reactive to, if a boss asks them to do something, the story that gets written is she's picking on me. Right. And so they don't see it as, oh, it's just a task I've been assigned. It's no, that boss is picking on me. And so the story gets written and then they get reactive. And then the next thing you know, they're spreading poison around the office or they're slamming papers or, they're crying at their desk because they feel that the boss is picking on them versus just assigning them a task. So
Gotcha.
it is the reactivity.
Okay. So when we look at the borderline personality disorder, what are the different traits
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
that?
Yep. And so what the DSM says is the first trait is the frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And so that's the first trait. The second trait is a pattern of unstable and intense personal relationships. So usually most of the time, unless they marry very young and have a very patient spouse, they have a pattern of broken relationships that were intense, and so that usually is a sign as well. And in their relationships, they'll alternate between you're the greatest person ever, you're my soulmate, which is also what a narcissist does, to you're just a piece of crap and I can't stand you and you treat me like crap. And so, you just don't know on which day what you're going to get. And that is where too that can happen. And if you're involved with somebody that is diagnosed as a narcissist, it's the same thing. It overlaps just like the borderline.
Okay.
And so, also also, too, they can have a very unstable self-image or sense of self, which can show up in things like body dysmorphia. So they might have a lot of surgeries to try to have the perfect body or the perfect face or the perfect anything because of the fact that they see themselves in such a bad way. They have a really poor self-image. In the high impulsivity, like we talked about, a lot of times they can have addictions.
Right.
And it may be a spending addiction, sex addiction, it could be gambling, it could be anything like that. Food, a lot of times will show up. Also, too, the suicidality. That can also be a sign, or self-harm if they're cutting.
Okay.
That can be one of the criteria. And then also the high reactivity, like we talked about, that's also one of the criteria. And so, which can show up as either high irritability, or it can show up as the meltdown that's consistent. And then chronic feelings of emptiness. So, oftentimes too, the interesting part is when they are in relationships, they may cheat. And they do that because they feel so empty on the inside. And so there's just really not enough attention to fill them up. And that too overlaps with the other personality disorders. And so then the intense anger and the difficulty controlling anger. So once they're angry, it's really hard to bring them down. And that's where the emotional regulation skills come in. And then the last criteria is the paranoid ideas. So you go to the grocery store and you come back and the borderline personality says, "Why were you gone so long? I know you must have been with a prostitute." Right. And so like this story got written because you were gone 10 minutes too long. Right.
Right.
And so it can get turned into all kinds of things. And so there's this paranoid idea, or I know you're going to leave me because I know you must have been out seeing someone because you were gone 30 minutes longer than you normally are. And so what they'll do is they'll hyper focus on their partner, and that partner becomes kind of the object of their affection, so to speak.
Right.
But then they're writing these horrific stories about what the partner must be doing because they can't possibly love them. And so it really does turn into paranoid ideas. And so the DSM says that you have to have 5 of these to be considered borderline.
Right.
And so those are the criteria.
More common in women or men?
More common in women, yeah. Where the other personality disorders are more common in men.
You have any personal theories on that, why that would be?
I don't. The way I was taught, and a lot of therapists don't agree with this concept, but it was the way that I was taught, and I tend to believe it the more I've been in this field, but that most people with personality disorders are born that way. They can be affected by environment, which would be trauma.
Sure.
Right. And so, but the research says that 97% are born that way. 3% are environmental or because
Nature
of
versus nurture.
Yeah, which
Right.
is childhood trauma. So like the concept is that, and I think we've talked about this before, if someone's born autistic, then they're always going to be autistic, right? Well, the same concept applies. If they are born personality disordered, then they're always going to be personality disordered. But out of all of the personality disorders, borderline is the most treatable. But the thing is that there are personality disordered individuals that are traumatized as children, and that's that environmental piece, and they're traumatized as children, and it changes their neural pathways. So even if they grow up and get treatment, the percentage of people that actually make change in the sociopath, psychopath, narcissist categories is very small. Borderline has more possibility of change as long as they're using their skills. But sometimes too, one of the things that I've noticed with borderline patients or clients is that they won't always do their homework. They won't always follow up on their skills. And so it's really hard to affect change with them at times.
Wow. So if you were going to, it would seem to me that one of the best things about if you are affected by a personality disorder, it sounds like you're almost lucky if you end up with borderline from the standpoint of treatability.
Yeah, correct. And if you are affected by someone with personality disorder, you will need trauma treatment, because a lot of the behaviors that you experience, the walking on eggshells, the always being wrong, being blamed for everything, it's traumatic. And especially if you end up feeling like you need to leave this relationship, it can cause damage with your children, and that can be traumatic. And so, as a partner or a spouse of someone that's plausibly personality disordered, it is best to go get your own trauma treatment to deal with the after effects of being with someone like that.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about that for just a second. The type of trauma treatment that is available to
Correct.
those that are in a relationship or have been in a relationship with someone that has a personality disorder. What kind of treatment is available?
Right. So I would look for several. I would look for somatic, which is body. So the new concept now is that, used to talk therapy was the answer to everything, right? Well, now what they're saying, and all of the research points to, that trauma is actually held in our bodies. That's why we get triggered, because our brain is recalling something from the past. It may not remember the exact incident. It just knows my body felt this way once before. So somatic work is body based. So it's all about healing the body and the triggers that come. And so that's somatic. EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization, is also a wonderful way. And so what they do is I use little hand zappers, but the goal is to get the eyes to switch left to right in order to be able to work on the triggers. The other therapy is called accelerated resolution therapy, which is art. And it's not like art. You're not going to go draw anything, but it's actually a faster version of EMDR. And then DBT can actually really help with emotional regulation, because a lot of times people come out of these relationships highly triggered. And so the littlest thing can trigger them, and doing some DBT to help with that emotional regulation is a great way. So there's some really good therapeutic interventions. And so look for therapists that are certified in trauma treatments. So any of those that I just listed, look for therapists that do that kind of work, and you'll get the trauma treatment that you need.
Okay. As we kind of close up here, any last parting thoughts that you would want to have people think about if they're either thinking that they have any one of these personality disorders of cluster B that we've been talking about, or they've been in a relationship with someone either currently or in the past?
Right.
Any things that you would like to say to them, or things that they should think about?
Yeah. And if you think that you have a personality disorder, then go get assessed, and go get assessed honestly. And really, if you want to know, be honest in your assessment, but also to be willing to get treatment, because there is some hope that there could be some change. Also, too, if you're a person that's been with someone or are with someone that's personality disordered, I highly recommend that you look for a therapist that specializes in narcissistic abuse or personality disorder abuse. And so that's the best way to get started, because you will want to do true trauma treatment as part of your recovery to heal from the abuse that you endured. Because typically, if you're in a relationship with someone that's personality disordered, you've been abused. And so if you've been with them, 20, 30 years, you have a lot of trauma, and that has to be worked through. So that's what I would recommend. And if anybody, needs help with that, they can reach out to me at my office, and we'll either, if we can get you in, we will. If not, we can recommend someone to you in your area.
I would imagine also, don't downplay just the amount of time that you have been with someone, because it doesn't take long to be with someone
Correct.
and to suffer trauma as a relation to that, and the impact that can have on you for years and years and years after something that was just over a very short period of time. So don't downplay that.
Absolutely. And trust yourself. If it's a flag, it's a flag. So I always tell clients, and it's so simple, but it's true. If it walks like a duck, it's a duck.
Right.
And so trust yourself. If you know something something doesn't feel right, it's not right. And so a lot of times a personality disorder person will try to get you to believe something different. And if you truly trust you, you'll be able to stand up against that and say, that's not true for me. And so, but watch for the flags, especially if you're dating. And if it's a flag, it's a flag, and don't question yourself on that.
Well, this has been a great session here, Cindy. Thank you. And everybody remember Cindy Hyde with Living Strong Counseling. And I appreciate you again. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for another edition of the Reclamation Transformation. And remember, change starts with you. So go out there and make your mark.